This is the last lecture on vision, and we're going to be moving at an increasing pace. The psychological pace will seem very fast and increase in its speed because of the material and the structure which we have. So you might look ahead. We talked last week about getting the pair of books that we're going to be using at the end of art, Stravinsky's The Poetics of Music and Schiller's On the Aesthetic Education of Man, to try and get this pair of books, even though it's about 3 months, actually about 2 months before we start with them. You might also look ahead towards science and try and obtain one of these little sets. UCLA will have these and Caltech will have these. These are little sets of building blocks, plastic building blocks. And what's beautiful about these sets is that with this very finite selection of materials, you can actually construct every single organic molecule in the universe. In other words, this is a very small alphabet which spells out the nature of life anywhere in this universe. And you can buy this kind of a set. I forget what it is, somewhere around $20. These kinds of sets, these kinds of pairs of books are tools which allow us to use our visionary context. A visionary context is different from an integral context. And one of the reminders at this particular time is that differentiation has an inverse quality to integration. Integration and differentiation are inverse processes of each other. They do form a complementation together, but their complementation is only in terms of a whole pattern. Come again. Differentiation is always inverse of integration. They never have a complementation unless you take the universe as a whole, or unless one is dealing with oneself as a complete whole. Now, this is a very common mistake made, and it's made all the way to the top. Really very good yogis also make this same mistake. Integration and differentiation only work as a complementarity in terms of a unique case, the case of wholeness. Anything short of that, they always work in an inverse manner. So that if you're using integration and differentiation energies simultaneously, indiscriminately, you're going to end up with confusion all the time. If you're trying to deal with experience with your language, you're going to want to put the emphasis on integral quality and not on differential quality. This lends a practical kind of indication, a navigational guide then, for someone on the cultural level. On the cultural level, you're going to want to look for a more integrated substrate of your activity, and you're going to want to respect tradition, for instance. But when you're dealing with a historical situation, which is diametrically opposed to a cultural situation, you want to weight it more towards the differential aspect and much less on the integral aspect. And so while respect for tradition is very commendable in terms of a cultural situation, in terms of a historical problem, leaning on tradition is an invitation to disaster. And also, a basic confusion between symbol and cosmos occurs on the very large scale. When we're looking to understand ourselves, if we confuse ourselves with the cosmos, or confuse the cosmos with ourselves, we end up with an illusion-generating conundrum. A conundrum is a disjunctive, not impossible of resolution in terms of its presentation. A knot is a one-dimensional, self-avoiding singular path. And a great deal of the problems that we face in our life come because we have knotted up our energy, and of course the universe, which has to work on similarity resonances, gives us knots in our daily life in resonance to the way that we're conducting ourselves. And any man, any woman who has ever worked on themselves and has come to the point of combing through and undoing some of these knots and getting themselves more ordered experiences that life all of a sudden gets a buoyancy. Openings occur where before there were just walls to slam it into. You have to use the correct grammar when you hit those walls. So this particular lecture today, at the end of Vision, emphasizes some very difficult issues to recognize, to recognize, and intellectually it takes a lot of discipline to be able to single them out and expressively make them clear in a discursive way so that you really understand what you're saying and able to say it specifically. That's very hard to do. And by the late 20th century, it requires a really powerful mathematical background to do that. Not many people have that. So we're doing an end run around this kind of language problem, this inability to right away master something that might take 10, 20 years to do. We're doing an end run around it. And we're utilizing a technique which has been developed here, and that is to apply a consistent methodological pattern that, if we stick with it, will take us all the way through all of the integrations and all of the differentiations and the major transformation that's necessary and carry us through. If one could visualize this for the general public, they would be clamoring. There would be miles and miles of lines of people waiting to get in, because it's like the ultimate roller coaster ride. It's a roller coaster ride on a Mobius strip. It's an unending roller coaster ride once you get going. You don't have to stop. Let's come back and let's take a look. If we wanted to really understand how to say these kinds of things, we would have to go to classic books like in the Princeton Mathematics series, E.J. McShane's Integration, appeared about 50 years ago, still in print. As I was saying earlier, nobody wants to redo this work, that's why they keep it in print. Once somebody has really done fine work, you keep it in print. On Chapter 9, Differential Equations, the very first sentence of 3 lines is all we need as an indication to be able to hear something that's important vis-a-vis our methodology of paired texts. Okay, here it is. in proving the fundamental existence theorem for solutions of systems of different differential equations, we need to know that a certain sequence of functions contains a uniformly convergent subsequence. Now, the trigger concept here is uniform. There is no way that an integration process can proceed until there's a kind of a uniformity. And we are all brought up in a generation that just absolutely recoils from any kind of uniformity whatsoever. We want everything to be new all the time. And there's no way to integrate on that basis. If you were a gardener and everything was completely new all the time, instead of having any plant that really was itself, they would all be sports. There'd be constant variable sports and nothing would ever bloom. You've seen rose bushes that develop a sport and all the energy goes into a long shoot and there's no blossom. And every gardener knows that you can't be polite about sports and just, trim them along with the rest of them. You have to take them out at the initial branching from the root. And then the plant, in this case a rose bush, will have its maturity, and if you care for it, it will blossom. It'll be there. The maturation of psychic energy is exactly in this way. The rose is not just a happenstance symbol of the soul. It's not just because it is pretty and it smells sweet and possibly edible. It's because the whole process has a correspondence all the way down a long line of pairs. And this brings us to a second really important point. The first is that the only way to have a convergence that integration carries through to an actuality, an existential actuality, it actually happens. The only way for you to be who you are actually is that the sequencing has to have some kind of uniformity. Usually what it's called today in molecular biology would be some kind of a substrate. For instance, the DNA of every living being has a common substrate. The phosphates and sugars that are there for it are the same whether you're a tree or a person or a gnat. And it's not like some kind of tyranny to share that kind of substrate. It in no way crimps variation. It in no way compromises freedom. Absolutely in no way. What it does ensure is that the integration will have a universal corresponding application. And the ancient wisdom tradition was always concerned about the correspondences holding. And those concerns, those ethical concerns of a wisdom teaching, that those correspondences hold everywhere at all times, was junked, was thrown away in the 17th century. At first by a small group of people, and then increasingly by larger groups of people, until in the 19th century, it simply, like a cancer, took over the entire situation. I did a whole lecture series once of about 26 lectures on the 19th century and showed how the progressive development of the history of ideas of the 19th century was the progressive dematerialization of matter. And from 1800 to 1899 is a long slide into an impossible universe, one in which the actuality of existence disappears increasingly into an immaterial phantom existence. And so one has this kind of situation that by the beginning of the 20th century, by the year 1900, anyone who was watching history of ideas with a open-eyed, comprehensive quality was very fearful of what was going to come. You could see a century of cultural warfare on a catastrophic, almost apocalyptic level, even at that time. And when the dam started to break, by the late 1920s, there were visionaries, someone like H.G. Wells, who simply wrote out the scenario of what was going to happen. And his book, made into a beautiful film in 1936, Things to Come, with Raymond Massey, is amazing. A sociologist like Petrim Sorokin wrote a scenario of what would happen year by year, decade by decade, throughout the rest of the 20th century, and we have followed it absolutely down the line. And incidentally, the end of Sorokin's decline, he uses an image. He says, when we have Rembrandts on beer cans, we will have junked the entire value system of Western history. Yeah, everyone understands that. And everyone knows we've gotten there. And we even pushed it even, fudged on that. Bad Rembrandts on cheap beer cans. Which the young, handsome fraternity boys of the leaders of the future can crush in their hands very easily because it's very thin aluminum. Well, now grown men are not going to go into battle for these guys for that purpose. Give them the Gary Cooper wave, right? See you later, boys. It's a very difficult thing to face a historical problem with a cultural tool. It's rather like trying to take a flint knife and figuring out how to pry open the atomic bomb before it goes off. It's totally inadmissible as anything practical. There's no way to do it. And as ridiculous as the example sounds, many, many cultures are trying to do just that. The situations in at least 24 countries around the world are people locked in cultures using the equivalents of their flint knives, trying to pry open the nuclear weapons, which they already have, to find out what makes them tick before they use them against people that they don't like. Now that situation cannot be left alone, but in order to handle it in a comprehensive, curative way, the procedure that has to follow is all dependent, ultimately, eventually, unavoidably, necessarily, on having an educated population of men and women who are, at least in the terms of sketching, able to handle themselves in terms of planetary history. There is no education today that prepares people for planetary history. And there's no way that the level of science that we have now is going to operate in a cultural vessel on anything less than planetary. Now, one of the largest cultures that we have today is the so-called Western civilization, which is really a culture. European post-Napoleon culture is one of the largest spread cultures in the world today, and it's completely unable to handle the problems of actual modern science. Now, the outdistancing of capacity to deal with the tools that one has is going to jump asymptotically. That's a mathematical term. It means once it starts on a line, it goes increasingly more. It goes 1, 10, 100, 1,000, a million, a billion, a trillion. I was looking at a book that came out just last week from Cambridge University Press on organic thin films. And a lot of the mechanical interfaces that cultures have become used to since the 17th century are going to be completely obviated by thin organic molecular films that will do the action without any mechanical qualities whatsoever. And putting thin organic films over liquid crystal structures are going to completely change what someone can even imagine as science fiction technology today. And that within the next 10 years easily. So this kind of education is unfortunately one of those kinds of iron bars which you have to go and pick up. It's like the Zen master who throws the iron bar down in front of the neophyte, and the neophyte meditates on it and goes through all the permutations of what you can and cannot do, and finally comes up with the realization that there is only a single choice. You can get up and leave, or you can go and pick up the metal bar. That's all that you can do. That the choice comes down to an existential yes or no. It's a trigger action. Now, we read from McShane 50 years ago, in proving the fundamental existence theorem for solutions of systems of differential equations, we need to know that a certain sequence of functions contains a uniformly convergent subsequence. Now, one of the peculiar qualities about higher mathematics is the ability to substitute functions and points. Points in space, points in time-space, substitute mathematically for the sequencing of functions in integrals and differentials. So that when you come to something, the first updating of McShane's integration, the general theory of integration by a man named Ralph Henstock, who's for 45 years been a champion in higher mathematics. This is the Oxford Mathematical Monographs, 1991. We don't have to go into it in depth. In fact, it's very difficult to go into something like this in depth without university graduate courses. I'm going to single out three words, just 3 words here, under the second chapter of General Theory of Integration, section 2.7, additive division spaces. And the section following it will be decomposable additive division spaces. The emphasis here is on division spaces. Notice here that space must be dividable in some way where the divisions of space can be additive, they can be added back together, and decomposable in the sense that they can be distinct from each other again and have entity class qualifications, definable. All of this comes from the 17th century. And all of it locates itself initially in the mind of a single man named René Descartes. And so this kind of space is called, from Descartes, is called Cartesian space. And Cartesian space was chosen over Hermetic space in the first third of the 17th century because the ancient Hermetic wisdom space had a musical corresponding quality which made it very difficult to work with unless you got wise. You had to be really wise to work with it intelligibly and use it. And there were very few wise people. There always have been very few wise people. There've never been a lot of wizards. It's like one of those never, never land scenarios where there's a whole room full of wizards. One of the rarest things in the universe are two wizards meeting each other. And they immediately go the opposite way. Not a word. So in the 17th century, in order to make it easier for more proletarian individuals to handle things and make things work, and the French were very concerned at having mechanical objects, and so Cartesian space has a mechanical quality. It is mechanically additive and decomposable, and the mathematics was developed to show this. And because this involves a lot of weird stuff at the edges, many things were swept under the rug at the time. And from time to time, very brilliant guys would reach under the rug and pull out one and display it and say, look here. What was it? Fermat was 300 years before somebody refound a solution that he put in the margin of one of his notebooks, that he'd found a solution for a certain logical conundrum, and but he didn't have time to write it down. And it took 300 years for somebody else to find what that solution was, and it bedeviled people. The solution was found just a couple of years ago, in the 1990s. Cartesian space, in its mechanical handleability, still counts on an ancient wisdom Hermetic quality. Now, the ancient wisdom, in the magical days when everybody could just say things, they would call it sympathy. Magic works by sympathy. How come what you do here has an effect out there? Because of sympathy. Because of correspondence. And the 17th century said, no, we're not buying that. We like Cartesian geometry and Cartesian space. We don't want to deal with the music of the spheres. We want to deal with what we can graph. If we can graph it, then we'll deal with it. Because with these graphs, we can get the trajectory of our bombs so that we can get you guys better than you can get us. And it's academic about everything else, isn't it? And so ballistics became like one of the big sciences late in the 17th century. Here are the three words out of Henstock. Notice how I jump back here surrealistically, like an intellectual Marx brother, right? What are those three words? Interval point pairs. Interval hyphen point pairs. Interval point pairs. I'll just read the paragraph, the sentence for you so you can hear what Henstock has. In this section, we assume that, and then within parentheses are three coordinates, capital T, italic T, and then a bold A. They're qualities of a math integration. In this section, we assume that is an additive division space and begin by reciting the definitions. Thus, in the non-empty base space T of points, we choose some non-empty subsets called generalized intervals I, with their italic T as their family, and italic U, a fixed non-empty family of interval point pairs. In order to have any kind of malleability intellectually of space, points have to actually occur. And those points have to have some kind of correspondence with points, so that the points here on this graph correspond to the points that are out there in the bridge or the building or the aircraft, the missile, whatever it is. There has to be a correspondence. And those points, in order to figure out how those points are moving around and arranging themselves, we have to be able to put those points into functional sequencing. And if we do that, we can work with it in such a way that it makes it easier for us to come up with a dynamic solution, which can then be interpreted technologically in terms of the arrangement of points, and thus the application is there. So that we have this kind of statement later on in McShane. A sequence of measurable sets, capital E sub 1, capital E sub 2, ... A sequence of measurable sets converges regularly to a point x sub 0 if there exists a set of cubes, that is, intervals all of whose edges are equal, with centers at x sub 0, and possessing the following properties: for each n, for each given n, the cube Qn contains the set En. As n tends towards infinity, the side of Qn tends towards 0. There's a highly yogic way of describing how realization actually happens. That realization is not an imaginative event. It's not a cross the fingers and hope event. It's not a non-event. It's not just a probable event. It's not a possible event only, but actually occurs. Realization, as a matter of fact, is indispensable for ideas. There can be no ideas because ideas are differential forms. There can be no ideas whatsoever until one is able to get it, to have an exact point of understanding. One has to be able to have a split second of understanding it. It means aha. In Plato's day, they actually used the term which translates as eureka, meaning I have found it, meaning I get it. There has to be a point in time where one gets it. Aha, that's it. If that point in time does not occur, that idea is never going to be functionally able to fly with you. You're never going to be able to use it. Now, if you can't use ideas, that means there's a ceiling, that you can't go any higher than that. Now, that ceiling is as high as the sky when we all lived on a tribal level. I mean, who cared? But when we live in a complex civilization like we have, everything that counts is above that ceiling. Every single thing that is a life and death issue to us and matters all the time is above that ceiling. And that ceiling is not some kind of wall because we're stupid. Not some kind of wall because it's just too complicated. There's no wall there at all. Rather, there is a thin, organic film that allows for osmosis only at exact specific points in exact timelessness, because that's the way the universe works. And that all of us have the capacity not only to go through that membrane once in a lifetime, but hundreds of millions of times every day if we need to. It is a thoroughly friendly membrane. It invites us. We have every capacity. Our energy works. We are evolved over billions of years to precisely work so that we go back and forth through that membrane anytime that we need to. We not only can go into a differential mode, we can go back into an integral mode. We can participate in a folk dance at whatever ethnic group we happen to belong to, or we can go into a planetary meeting with a corporation that deals with worldwide phenomena. Do you think that the DreamWorks boys are not going to deal with the Chinese just because they're Chinese? They have a whole different culture? No. They want to rent their movies in China. So there's a whole thing about planetary scale is what we're trying to say. So that this is not some kind of esoteric education. It's not some kind of academic education. It is simply putting into a language sequence, into a sequence which is measurable, which is additive and decomposable, so that it integrates and differentiates. And that the procedure of doing this is the same throughout. And one of the reasons of using pairs of texts is because these interval point pairs need to keep their correspondence. It's just like if you look at the structure of the DNA and you see the helical form, everywhere, even though it turns, and it turns in precise degrees, always at the same exact precise degree, never more, never less, but at each degree point, there is a bond, a chemical bond, a sugar bond, a hydrogen bond that goes across to a corresponding molecule. So that the molecules always occur in pairs. Always occur in pairs. So that when they split their linking bond, they naturally, each one generates their complement out of themselves. And that's how reproduction happens. There would be no further life forms whatsoever if that didn't happen. They always generate the missing pair. Always. That's how life works. That's how organic reality works. In just the same way, if we have ourselves in some kind of integral mode, we're coming out of a cultural situation, we're coming out of our own mental situation, and we're coming into possession of those seed moments of realization, of the beginnings of using ideas, we find within ourselves, even though it happens microscopically, even less than microscopically, on a molecular and atomic level, nevertheless, the beginnings of thought engender in us the need to generate pairs for these singular points of penetration. And if we're not taught in a wisdom tradition how to do that in a realistic way, then we make up in a fantasizing way on an individual basis with very little background. We make the stuff that dreams are made of. And these are metaphysical systems. All metaphysical systems are thus flawed by this particular development. There are none of them corresponded. None of them with nature. None of them correspond with nature. They're all very clumsy cookie cutters. And if you took one out into interstellar space, you could stamp forever and you'd never make a form. Never. But what's beautiful is that all of that is extraneous. No one needs to do that at all. Because the universe has been real and conscious long before our individual vehicle came into being. And the universe is vastly intelligent, is already a cosmos. Already calling to and welcoming and enveloping and supporting and allowing for that process of penetration many, many times by the beginnings of vision to come out of the brain. And when the vision begins to project out of the brain, then you have mind. Then you have mind. And mind is able to carry itself very, very, very far. One of the first objective phenomena that happens when the differential energies of the mind work in their own way is that the person takes objective form, objective shape. One's person actually exists. It's not approximation. It's specifically, accurately, existentially, really there. Now, this used to be called character. It used to be called character. That human beings used to ever understand that everyone has a character. Babies already have certain character, you can tell. You see some little boy baby going hell-bent for leather around the room on all fours, you know he's going to be a hellion. Wait till he gets a motorcycle. You can see it already. That's his character. He's that way. Now you can train a puppy, you can train a horse, you can train them any way you want. You can train plants. But human character, you can't train. It's going to be there. It's going to find some way to use the techniques that you glommed onto it and use those for its own purposes at some time or other. And if it doesn't, then that character will be muffled and not active. It will be anesthetized. And yes, you can muffle the human character. You can anesthetize it. You can numb it out. You can brutalize it. But given any kind of encouragement, it says, that's what I want to do. I've always wanted to do it. And I'm going to do it. And as soon as someone is released from these concentration camps of these phony metaphysical systems, they're gone. They're ready to be who they are. See you later. I'm busy. I remember a panel in a Donald Duck comic book from the mid-1940s. And at the end of the story, it took place in Africa, this black cannibal guy with the bone in the hair had this fistful of money. And he had this big smile on his face. And Donald Duck asked him, "Where are you going?" And he said, "Cape Town, boys, shopping." As soon as the human character gets any kind of freedom in this universe, you're going to do exactly what you really are made to do. Your character is going to come out and be active. That's a differential form that is very real. It's better to have a planet of real characters rather than some cemetery world of metaphysical phantoms. There are a lot of haunted worlds. This doesn't need to be one of them. And what's amazing is that the character, your specific individual character, has a universal correspondence. There is a quality to the cosmos that corresponds to you exactly. And when you are there, it makes an energy bond with you. And that energy bond is like regaining a spiritual umbilical. And because it's tuned in to everything that is, they don't need to know. They're not paying. If they don't know this by the 22nd century, let them work it out. As soon as that energy bond anneals itself to someone, your character gets a kind of a glow. It's the glow which is undifferentiable from the outside from somebody who becomes a daring hero or daring heroine. You get a quality of courage in the cosmos, which once it's there, no one can take that away. It's indelible. More after the break. This is the tattooing of a face on a Maori mask. And this illustration occurs in lecture notes in physics. Time harmonic in electromagnetic fields and chiral media. And these kinds of lecture notes, these are published in Berlin, Springer Verlag. Chiral media means something that has a light scattering capacity where either right-handed or left-handed is emphasized. So that seashells and the double helix of the DNA, all of these kinds of forms, scatter light in such a way that the rotation of light, which has alternate fields, that the two different fields will be slightly out of phase, and depending on what the media is, the right-handed or the left-handed phase of the light wave will hit first, and so you will get a patterning that favors right-handed or left-handed light, so that it will be an optical illusion. It will be a vision that this kind of quality happens. In this universe, what we take to be time, that is the ordinary time that we have, is a scattering phenomena in a chiral medium. And that time seems to flow only forward, is asymmetrical, as they say, is an optical illusion. And the first person to ever prove this mathematically was Einstein. And I have a quotation here, if I can find it. Probably can't find it now that I need it. Oh, here it is. This is in The Physical Basis of the Direction of Time, also published in Berlin recently. In the epilogue, 4 weeks before his death, 1955, Albert Einstein wrote in a letter of condolence to the family of his lifelong friend Michael Besso, quote, "For us believing physicists, the division into past, present, and future has merely the meaning of an albeit obstinate illusion. There's no doubt that Einstein meant this remark very seriously. So when we're dealing with our maturity, we're trying to be as full and as real, as specifically ourselves as we can. That's what education is about, after all. It's what we would like to know. We'd like to find that out. Who are we? Where are we? What are we doing? What is there to do? Who are you? How can we relate? What could happen? What can happen? What will happen? All of these kinds of simple questions are childlike and not childish at all. We would all like to know. But an education which enables us, just like a technological enabling, an education that enables us to really answer these kinds of questions has to take us through a maturation procedure. And that maturation procedure takes a while. It takes about 2 years. I can't condense it any more than that. I've tried. That's the best I can do. There'll be people in the future they'll be back to the weekend guru stuff. Faulkner said in his Nobel Prize speech, he said that when the last ding-dong of doom approaches, the planet will be one unobstructed concrete freeway with stations that pop up and fuel our passions, our desires, and our vehicle all in one great spurt. And we will be able to cruise unhindered anywhere that we wish to go. But there will not be silence in the world because men will still be complaining. One more thing, he said, is man's voice still talking, still complaining about why it can't be better. So this education, though it has its depths and its seriousness, is made to work for you if you just do it. And this doesn't mean having to do all this reading. It doesn't mean having to understand all of this. But it's like getting a suntan. All you have to do is bag the rays. The rays will be there. Definitely they'll be there. And you may not know the physics of how you got that suntan, but you'll be able to go out and look positively Caribbean. It doesn't seem like much now, but there'll come a time in a couple of years that you'll be able to walk into a room full of people and vibrate. And believe me, people pick that up. Part of the chiral property of time, that it favors a future, depends upon the unbalanced integration which we have in terms of experience. Our whole weighting, that is giving weight to the future, comes from an unbalance on the cultural level. So that when people come particularly in an uninformed way into vision from a culture and have not really matured in the symbols area, not really matured in the deeper meanings of integration, the very first thing that you notice is that they have an addiction to prophecy. It's the first medical symptom. A doctor of civilization notes right away, oh, it's got that fever, prophetic fever. You become a sucker for prophecy. What's going to happen in the future? Nostradamusitis. It was the first group that mishmashed the beautiful words of Jesus, were the people who were feverish over prophecy in the first century AD. First thing they wanted to know, well, when's he coming again? As Jack Nicholson would say, geez, you're just here. And if we understood it right, he's still here. Yeah, but when's he coming again? That's where the phrase, for Christ's sakes, came in. Excuse me. Sorry. It's a particular indication because on the cultural level, on the tribal level, cultures are resonances of the tribal level. The tribe is a resonance of experience, and experience is founded upon language. And in a myth, one is always telling the story. The storyline has to move forward. Like I've been introduced to the Hollywood seriousness that you've got to move the story forward. A lot of things I could say, and probably will. There are a lot of stories that do very well that don't move forward. But be that as it may, it's like a Shakespearean play. It doesn't move forward, it just moves towards completion. Yeah. All visionary forms move towards completion. They don't move just forward. They move deeper, they move higher. They bring back and recycle the past more so that you get a fullness. And very often, some of the best time tenses in art are present tense and not forward movement at all. So that, for instance, there's a very satisfying quality, say, to the music of like Alan Hovhaness, in comparison to, say, the music of Mozart. In comparison, not in just contrast, but also in correspondence. One of the great joys of Mozart's music is that when the musical form is finished, it's finished. He really did it. You don't want to add another note. You don't want to change the timing at all. This is perfect. This Mozart sonata really is right there. And so that when it is finished, when you finish playing it, the form is achieved. Musical form is achieved. Now in Hovhaness, he doesn't have any kind of forward-moving mythic music line, but nevertheless matures a pattern. But when the pattern is finished, it's really there. It's very satisfying. This quality of maturation in art is really apparent in people. The art of person making is remarkable because when you are really yourself, and there are moments when everybody recognizes, I'm here. It is so satisfying. There isn't any other place you want to go to. And in fact, you kind of dig your heels in because you don't want anything to change because this is really mellow. Because the experience of one's completeness is not only mellow, it's, what do they used to say, congruent in geometry. There's a congruency. So that instead of being out of phase and having a chiral phenomenon of wondering what's next, you don't even look at your watch. You don't care in the sense of what's next or what you had done before. It's you're here now. And it's that kind of quality that used to be called the upstandingness of character. You're who you are now. And that quality, poetically, is like the prow of a ship. You can tell how long it's been since anybody talked this way. It's like the prow of a ship that is able to navigate across an ocean where there are no shores to keep track of whatsoever. And once you're out of sight of a shore, an ocean is literally an unboundedness. All one needs to know is the correspondence of the star patterns. In logic, sometimes they're called star sets. Remarkable. Well, all one has to know is that the star sets correspond exactly, interval point pair by point pair, with the ocean that you're really on. And that your navigation in terms of the stars is actually happening on the ocean. Though you cannot confirm it in terms of any kind of old-fashioned sighting of the heads of land, nevertheless you have confidence that you can do this. Now, it isn't just Prince Henry the Navigator, the Portuguese rediscoverer of this. Long before he discovered this, the Polynesian natives used to navigate the Pacific Ocean very well. That's how the Maoris got to New Zealand. That's how the Polynesians got to Hawaii and Tahiti. They're very good at this kind of celestial navigation. We need that kind of quality in the next section in art. We need to have that kind of courage, that kind of confidence that what we're doing in art corresponds in a very realistic way to this universe and to ourselves. Why do we need that assurance now? Why do we need this kind of doctor's bedside manner now? Because the person is going to be equidistant between the zero of realization and the infinity of the cosmos. And the more we come to our own selves, the more we come to a precise exactness in between zero and infinity. And without the courage of the heart to go ahead and let that be, on the tribal level, on the cultural level, all the built-in governors about precariousness and perilousness come into play. Because it's precisely the free-standing, upright singularity of one's own character that is the ultimate position of peril in somebody who is locked into a cultural situation. So that in a way, the individual and the culture are diametrically opposed. They are a disjunctive pair. They are nevertheless a pair, but they are a disjunctive pair. The more one becomes an individual in a culture, the more you are an outlaw. One of the unsung Hollywood movies, Steelyard Blues, Donald Sutherland says to Jane Fonda, she says to him, you've become a common criminal. And he says, oh no, I haven't. He says, I'm an outlaw. It's totally different. The individual and the culture, because they are a disjunctive pair, they stretch that energy to its full diameter of the sphere. And literally at that point, there is a quality to the moment of me against the world. The full power of one's individuality requires the courage to pass through that moment of me against the world. It isn't true that it's you against the world. It's an optical illusion of psychic energy. It's just not true at all. But it feels like, it experiences like, it thinks like that is what the case is. Fortunately, it doesn't last very long, usually. because the general play of events, the general chiral illusion of time, gives rise to the popular saying, all things will pass, and even this will pass. Two things help us, and that is when integration happens to the point of getting it. Ideas, the seeds of ideas, to self-realization, to those moments of poignancy, those kinds of moments. There are two phases to integration that happen, and they happen so subtly that sometimes they're missed completely, and quite frequently they're not able to be distinguished one from the other. But on refinement, these two phases happen. The penultimate phase, that is one before the last phase, is acceptance. And the last phase is absorption. And the very next phase is emission, to keep it in a physics. Now, on pages 28 and 29 of our navigation chart, this is how it reads, just the first couple of sentences on acceptance. The last stage of integration is surrender. The releasing of resistance to complete. In other words, the very last resistance is a resistance to complete. And it clothes itself in all kinds of wonderful, platitudinous absurdities. Who am I to think that I could be me? That's how we knew that Peter and Paul were Christians, because they said together, Jesus Christ. If you can't be you, who's going to be that? There's no non-sequitorial quality to you being you. You're designed to be you. Go ahead. Splurge. You've got you're the latest model of you. You've been you so many times. It's a false humility not to just be you. So the releasing of resistance to complete affects the completion. Now notice that you cannot give it up. You have to release it. It's different. Giving it up has a very difficult to understand little snag in it. Because giving it up is always conditioned by the cultural matrix out of which such activities happen. And giving in a cultural setting is always tinged with reciprocity. Always. And it comes out most poignantly when you're on the verge of something really important, which usually comes vis-a-vis somebody else, and you're about to surrender, to give up this resistance to complete, and they don't. This is where the phrase, well, you son of a bitch, that's where that comes from. I'm putting my hide on the line, and you're holding back. Well, it's not that at all. That's irrelevant. There's no reciprocity in releasing. There's only one key to one jail door, and you have it. There's no reciprocity. The warden doesn't have to give you anything in return. It's your releasing, so that the releasing of resistance to complete affects the completion. That is the completion. The releasing is the completion. It's like the open-handedness is the sign that you released it. That's why the open hand is one of the most archetypal symbols of artistic beings. When Paleolithic art began to emerge some 30, 40,000 years ago, the very first symbol of the presence of a person was the open hand. And the open hand is not painted on the cave wall. It's stenciled on. It's stenciled by one's own hand being placed on the wall and the colored medium being mulched in the mouth and blown over it. It stencils, it leaves the handprint. It's only later that one does that. One makes a stamp of that. The very first occurrence of that is that one's own creative breath makes the form of the symbol of the person. God's breath gives life to the reality of the soul. The soul, qua soul, is nowhere at all. It doesn't exist in time or space at all. No matter how many lectures people give on the soul, there's no telephone book of information about the soul. But the projected expression of the soul as a person, there are not enough worlds to contain the library of books that could be written on that. But the person is always going to be at the apex of presencing, equidistance between zero and infinity. Notice now that the person is not where the soul is and not where the cosmos is, but equidistance from both. So that zero and infinity have a kind of, how can we say this? They're invariably equivalencing. When the person is real, zero and infinity are invariably happening together in tandem. So that the soul and the cosmos are literally the wings of the person. Now, the person is not a metaphysical event. Is not a metaphysical object at all. Is in fact objective. How objective? As objective as existence. However much objectivity existence has to you, the person is equally objective. Your person. This is why we are able to inhabit fully a universe which has materiality. Otherwise, note, otherwise, our persons would be out of phase. Just a chiral phenomenon would be real. Not just a chiral phenomenon as an optical illusion of right-handed or left-handedness in terms of light, but it would make of the entirety of the fabric of reality a chiral medium, and the more that we came into possession of the presencing of our person, the more the optical illusion would occur. And that just simply is not the case. You can confirm that for yourself. What is the case is clarity, certainty. And this then is the traditional name for this was absorption. The mythic horizon is concerned with absorbing experience. This absorption is done through activities and then images associated with those activities. For instance, a primal activity in the mythic horizon is ritual dance. The dance, especially its steps, its movement articulations, is one of the basic ritual comportments. Adjoining the dance movements, in close associative relations, are costume, makeup, ceremonial implements. The dance is the ritual per se, while the costumes, etc., pertain to ceremonial or ceremonial images. Dance denotes ritual, costume denotes ceremony, would be a short form of the conception. Absorbing experience in the mythic horizon has a ritual and ceremonial aspect, both carried over from the ritual or mask levels. But the mythic horizon also adds language, so that singing or chanting completes the raising of ritual to myth. Silent dancing, even with costumes, would be ritual. Or where the language is mere rote and not understood in any feeling-toned way, this could be said to show a regression from the mythic horizon back to ritual level. Somebody just mumbling a prayer has regressed. Somebody just mouthing the words to a song and not singing the song, it's just fooling around. Such chants without meaning, or to be more exact, without knowing the meaning, indicates magic spells that are formulated, like abracadabra, and being uttered always are a regressed phenomena, going back to the ritual level. Somebody just mouthing a magic spell and not knowing how to sing it invites that regression into their psychic energy. Just invitation, and the winds that blow in those vast spaces carry you away very quickly. Ritual magic is therefore a regression par excellence. Not magic at all, having no radiance of symbolic consciousness, merely an imploded artificial light. These are the fading forms in hell that Homer used to write about. One simply becomes a fading imprint of a mask instead of oneself. None of this is necessary at all. It doesn't have to happen. It doesn't have to happen at all. It doesn't have to continue to happen if it's happening. But in order to cinch oneself so that you don't slide back into this ritual regression, art is the indispensable. What is art good for? Art is the indispensable objectivity that stops forever that tendency to slide regressively back into ritual. So that in a way we will find that art and ritual are diametrically opposed, just like the individual and culture. A consummate artist is looking for original creativity, not from popping his suspenders, but because he doesn't want to be caught dead with some tired old ritual way of doing it. Wants to find a new way. And goes to the radical extreme of saying, well, everybody else's originality is their originality and not mine. It's original for them, but to me it's ritual, and I want to do it my way. If we found somebody producing art very similar, say, like we look at early Cubism, and there are some pieces you cannot tell whether it's Juan Gris, Georges Braque, or Picasso. Why? Because there was a phase to Cubism where it was very ritualistic. Very ritualistic, not art at all. Yet, as soon as the same technique is used by Picasso, say, in the 1930s for his painting The Three Musicians, there's no way Georges Braque would never do that. Could never have done that. Juan Gris could never have done that. Only Picasso could have done The Three Musicians. Unmistakably Picasso's character. There's no way that you can miss that. Sign of a great artist. To not only be able to do original art in their own way, but to be able to pass through this kind of molten, regressive situation that one had gone into, like early Cubism was. The same thing in Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. There are a lot of musical, rhythmic structures that are definitely tribal in Stravinsky. And had he not have been a consummate artist, the piece would have gotten away with him and would have sucked him in. It would have been pre-World War I rap music. But Stravinsky was, like Picasso, enough of an artist that he was able to pull what he wanted to be the musical form out of that. And you find a tremendous development at that time. So when we go into art next week, we want to have some way in which we can spur our creativity and also guard ourselves against having a pseudo-creativity which slides back into ritual without our even knowing of it. Over many years, I've found that there are two little kickers in this work. In this particular task, this is a task, like one of the labors of Hercules. It's a very difficult task. How to keep your own creativity highly characterized by yourself, individual, and not slide back into just rote comportment. But also not to get so precocious and precious about it that there's no way that it can be changed in the sense of destroyed or made better or a variant of it. So I have two assignments in art for us. Two assignments that work together, and all you have to do is just go through it and just do them. The first one is to make a painting. Everyone make a painting. And we can talk more about this when we get to art. It can be in any style, whatever you want to do. It can be anything. In any style, you don't even have to know how to paint. It doesn't matter. It does not matter. The second is to make a sculpture. A painting and sculpture are remarkably different, yet they have links to them. Now, the sculpture that you make is going to be passed to somebody else, and their sole purpose is to deface your sculpture, to remake whatever you made into their own sculpture. And in order to cool their heels, we do this process again, that their remake of your sculpture gets remade by a third person. I've found that that's psychologically necessary. 25 years ago, when I first was working on working out these things, I never understood the depths to which grudges are held on this level. You're the one who did in my sculpture, right? Well, this is just desserts because you will live to see, that smart guy got his up comeuppance. And you need that. None of us are that angelic yet that we don't need that satisfaction. Aha. He earned that, or she earned that. So the sculptor is going to go through 3 different sculptors. The sculpture is going to go through 3 different sculptors. So, try to say that without breakfast. So the sculpture needs to be presented right away. So you want to do the sculpture sometime in the next 2 or 3 weeks. And don't get too involved with it. Don't make it too expensive because it's going to be destroyed. I mean, not destroyed, but somebody else is going to rework it. And then a third person is going to rework their reworking. And the only salvation in this is that you are going to get to choose who does this. So when you make your sculpture, be thinking also of who you're going to give it to. Now, notice some people are going to be popular scapegoats. They're going to have a whole bunch of sculptures. We have to distribute this out. So first come, first served. And everybody who makes a sculpture will get a sculpture to redo, to improve on. And then we'll do it a third time. And we'll try and space it so there's about a month in between these, so that over a period of 3 months of a season, we'll have a season of doing in artworks. At the same time, as sort of an undercurrent underneath it all, you get to make a painting which nobody can touch. It's yours alone, only yours. And at the end of the art, 3 months from now, everybody will bring in on the same day the paintings, and we'll have a gallery scene. And it'll be interesting. And I, for the first time, will take an active part with the paintings. You notice during all the projects, during the education, I always absent myself. My whole responsibility was not to be here. Whereas with the paintings, for the first time, I'm going to actively involve myself as a part of the experiencing group, as a part of the class. I get to put my 2 cents worth in too, about the paintings, not about the sculptures. Now these 2 assignments, these 2 projects, go together with the way in which the pairs of texts that we have are going to operate together. And in order to set this up, I scoured the world, the planet, its heritage, to try to find somebody who was fluid enough to be complete on every level, from immanence to transcendence, and have an energy tone that carries consistently all the way through that total spectrum. And the best person on this planet that I found for this was Rumi. Jalaluddin Rumi, known in Iran as Malavi. Rumi's poetry is the best that there is on the planet for being able to go the complete spectrum from an eminent tribal gut level to the most transcendent, rarefied individual atmosphere, and back again instantly. And so next week I'll talk about the mystical poems of Rumi as an interval, and that'll be like the setup for the first pair of books that come into play in art. Kandinsky's Concerning the Spiritual in Art. It's a $2 paperback from Dover. And John Dewey's Art as Experience. Now, if you can't find Art as Experience, we'll make some copies of some of the passages that I would like you to consider. And again, I know that you're all mature people. You don't have time for this. I know that you don't have time for this. I'm just trying, like your friendly Puck, to say, steal time for this. I know you don't have time for this. Steal time for this. Steal it from somebody else. steal it for yourself. Honestly, they may never miss it. But the hour or two that you steal from them for yourself may make a difference. So, Hermes, before he was a wisdom master, was a thief. He began as a thief. He came out as a thief. It's just like one of the Fortunate Falls, the first thing he stole was Apollo's cattle. I mean, he started big. And he had to become a wisdom teacher because when you have Apollo on your case, you've got to do something. That's enough.